Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the topic inbreeding, inbreeding coefficient and its genetic consequences. The main objectives of today's lecture are to know the basics of inbreeding, that is inbreeding coefficient and its genetic consequences, to know the explanation of inbreeding in animal populations, to understand the inbreeding coefficient, to understand about the genetic disorders related to inbreeding, to know some examples of genetic disorders related to inbreeding. Dear students, let's start with the introduction to inbreeding first. Inbreeding is the mating of organisms closely related by ancestry. It goes against the biological aim of mating, which is the shuffling of DNA. Human DNA is bundled into 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 pair autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. Within each chromosome there are hundreds of thousands of genes, and moreover each gene has 2 copies known as alleles. Genes determine different aspects of appearance like hair and eye color, as well as biological factors such as the blood type. These genes fall into 2 categories, dominant and recessive. If one of the genes in the pair is dominant, then the result is gain of the trait of dominant gene. However, for traits that originate from the recessive gene, both genes need to be recessive. For example, the gene for brown eyes is dominant, and so having just one of these in a pair will result in brown eyes, that is the dominant gene will express. However, the gene for the blue eyes is recessive, so there is the need of both of them to get blue eyes, that is both of them should be present together. This is important as certain congenital defects and genetic diseases such as cystic fibrosis are carried by recessive alleles. Inbreeding stacks the odds of being born with such conditions. As blood relative mating partners have similar DNA, the chance of them carrying the same recessive gene is greatly increased. According to a study, the rate of neonatal and childhood death increases if the child comes from a first cousin union, nearly doubling in certain countries. As inbreeding comes with such a high cost, the logic of engaging it might seem baffling. In hereditary systems of rule, such as the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, inbreeding prevented another family marrying in and lining up to take the throne. Dear students, let's know the explanation of inbreeding in animal populations. Selection in animal breeding systems uses genetic diversity or variation to improve the population by selecting superior animals for desirable traits. The more genetic variation observed in a population, the bigger the potential genetic gain possible in each generation. Conversely, decreased genetic variation increases the similarity of the population. So inbreeding reduces the amount of genetic diversity in a population. Explanation of inbreeding in animal population relies on a few basic genetic principles. So genetic information is stored in chromosomes. Chromosomes are made up of DNA. Genes are sections of DNA and occur in pairs. A particular gene will occur at a particular site, that is at a particular locus in the DNA of a particular chromosome. The different forms of gene, usually 2, that can occur at that locus are called as alleles, or they are also called as alternative forms of a gene. Where both alleles are the same at the locus, they are called homozygous. Where the alleles are different, they are called heterozygous. In general, 2 alleles will have an equal influence on the performance of an animal. That is the heterozygous form. Both alleles are present, tend to have performance midway between the 2 homozygous forms. In a few cases, one allele will have the main dominant effect on an animal, while the other allele will only have an effect in its homozygous form. That means when both the recessive alleles are present. These are called dominant and recessive genes. Offsprings of biologically related persons are subject to the possible effects of inbreeding, such as congenital birth defects. The chances of such disorders are increased when the biological parents are more closely related. This is because such pairing have a 25% probability of producing homozygous zygotes, resulting in offspring with two recessive alleles, which can produce disorders when these alleles are deleterious. Because most recessive alleles are rare in populations, it's unlikely that two unrelated marriage partners with both be carriers of the same deleterious allele. However, because close relatives share a large fraction of their alleles, the probability that any such deleterious allele is inherited from the common ancestor through both parents is increased dramatically. For each homozygous recessive individual formed, there is an equal chance of producing a homozygous dominant individual, one completely devoid of the harmful allele. Dear students, let's now discuss about the inbreeding coefficient. The coefficient of inbreeding, as proposed by Sewell Wright in 1922, is the probability that two alleles at a randomly chosen locus or site or position are identical by descent. Note that alleles may be identical for other reasons, but the inbreeding coefficient is just looking at the mathematical probability that the alleles have come from a common ancestor. As inbreeding increases, the frequency of alleles being homozygous at a particular locus also increases. Hence, inbreeding reduces the amount of variation in a population. Line breeding attempts to maximize desirable homozygous alleles, that is, fix these desirable genes in the population using selection and planned breeding programs, a sort of controlled inbreeding. However, an increase in homozygous alleles may also increase homozygous alleles with undesirable effects, which can result in reduced performance and fertility, that is, inbreeding depression, or even be fatal, that is, lethal recessives. The converse of inbreeding is outcrossing. Some component of observed hybrid vigor is the outcrossing effect. It is important to remember that two inbred animals that are unrelated themselves will have fully outcrossed progeny, that is, inbreeding coefficient of 0. Hence, organism can go from inbred to outbred crossed in one generation. Inbreeding represents the mating of genetically related individuals. Inbreeding causes certain individuals within a population to be homozygous, meaning they have the exact same two alleles for a single gene. Alleles are different variants of a gene. The inbreeding coefficient represents the probability that an individual has two identical alleles for the same gene. The inbreeding coefficient can be determined by looking at someone's pedigree or family tree. Using the pedigree and finding the inbreeding coefficient, one can determine which relative mated to produce the inbred individuals. The coefficient of inbreeding has become one of the most powerful tools a breeder can use, not only to predict the potential danger possible from a particular mating in terms of decreased fitness and increased incidence of genetic disease, but also to anticipate an animal's possible value in the genetic improvement of the next generation. Dear students, let's now discuss the normal inbreeding coefficient. So, when learning how to calculate the inbreeding coefficient, the lower the inbreeding coefficient, the lower co-ancestries or shared genes. A value lower than 5% is desirable. An inbreeding coefficient of 25% indicates the mating of parents and children, while as an inbreeding coefficient of 6.25% indicates the mating of first cousins. Dear students, let's now talk about the consequences of inbreeding. Humanity has not just used inbreeding to retain legal status, it has also deployed inbreeding animals. Mice used in lab experiments are often inbred as the similar genetic structures enable experiments to be repeated and get the reproducible results. Controlling outcomes is also the motivation for inbreeding in the farming industry, with cows being bred to increase milk yields and sheep are carefully selected to produce more wool. There is evidence that suggests inbreeding certain animals can have more of a negative impact than a positive one. The two largest populations of koalas in Australia could cease to exist by just one disease due to them being heavily inbred, scientists have warned. A study examined inbreeding in pedigree dogs. Like the animals bred for farming, particular traits are encouraged in pedigree dogs, including their height and the quality of their fur. The study found that a large proportion of pedigree dogs suffered from conditions caused by recessive alleles such as heart disease, deafness, and abnormal development of their hip joints. The problem is more alarming than it might seem on the surface. 20,000 pedigree boxer dogs would have the genetic variety of around 70 dogs. Used without consideration of both positive and negative effects, inbreeding is invariably destructive. But used carefully as part of a breeding plan that strategically balances its benefits and dangers, inbreeding can be a powerful tool. A limited gene pool in a species can unsurprisingly have a negative impact. This is known as inbreeding depression and refers to a population decrease due to lack of healthy mates. Inbreeding results in homozygosity, which can increase the chances of offspring being affected by the recessive trait. In extreme cases, this usually leads to at least temporarily decreased biological fitness of a population called inbreeding depression, which is its ability to survive and reproduce. An individual who inherits such deleterious traits is colloquially referred to as inbred. The avoidance of expression of such deleterious recessive alleles caused by inbreeding via inbreeding avoidance mechanisms is the main selective reason for outcrossing. Crossbreeding between populations sometimes has positive effects on fitness-related traits, but also sometimes leads to negative effects known as outbreeding depression. Dear students, let's now understand inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is a term used to describe the reduction in performance and viability due to the increase in inbreeding levels, reduced genetic variation. Reproductive fitness tends to be affected more than performance traits in this respect. Malformation or harmful traits or characters can stay within a population due to a high homozygosity rate, and this will cause a population to become fixed for certain traits like having too many bones in an area, like the vertebral column of wolves on Isle Royale, or having cranial abnormalities such as in northern elephant seals where their cranial bones length in the lower mandibular tooth row has changed. Having a high homozygosity rate is problematic for a population because it will unmask recessive deleterious alleles generated by mutations, reduce heterozygote advantage, and it is detrimental to the survival of small endangered animal populations. When deleterious recessive alleles are unmasked, due to increased homozygosity generated by inbreeding. This can cause inbreeding depression. The extent of inbreeding depression depends on the population being measured, the level of genes already fixed in the population, the frequency of any deleterious genes that may exist in the population, and chance effects of which particular genes are affected. There is no defined limit as to what is an acceptable level of inbreeding in domestic animal populations. However, inbreeding depression is likely to be more apparent once inbreeding levels get to about 10%. As a very rough guide, there is often a 2 to 20% decrease in performance of the trait per 10% of inbreeding coefficient. Dear students, let's now discuss the genetic disorders related to inbreeding. Autosomal recessive disorder occurs in individuals who have 2 copies of an allele for a particular recessive genetic mutation. Except in certain rare circumstances such as new mutations or uniparental disomy, both parents of an individual with such a disorder will be carriers of the gene. These carriers do not display any sign of the mutation and may be unaware that they carry the mutated gene. Since relatives share a higher proportion of their genes than do unrelated people, it is more likely that related parents will both be carriers of the same recessive allele, and therefore their children are at a higher risk of inheriting an autosomal recessive genetic disorder. The extent to which the risk increases depends on the degree of genetic relationship between parents. The risk is greater when the parents are close relatives and lower for relationships between more distant relatives such as second cousins, though still greater than for the general population. Children of parent-child or sibling-sibling unions are at an increased risk compared to cousin-cousin unions. Inbreeding may result in a greater than expected phenotypic expression of deleterious recessive alleles within a population. As a result, first-generation inbred individuals are more likely to show physical and health defects, including reduced fertility both in litter size and sperm viability, increased genetic disorders, fluctuating facial asymmetry, lower birth rate, higher infant mortality and child mortality, smaller adult size, loss of immune system function, increased cardiovascular risks. The isolation of a small population for a period of time can lead to inbreeding within that population, resulting in increased genetic relatedness between breeding individuals. Inbreeding depression can also occur in a large population if individuals tend to mate with their relatives instead of mating randomly. Due to higher prenatal and postnatal mortality rates, some individuals in the first generation of inbreeding will not live on to reproduce. Over time, with isolation such as a population bottleneck caused by purposeful, that is assortive breeding or natural environment factors, the deleterious inherited traits are eliminated. Island species are often inbred as their isolation from the large group on a mainland allows natural selection to work on their population. This type of isolation may result in the formation of race or even speciation, as the inbreeding first removes many deleterious genes and permits the expression of genes that allows a population to adapt to an ecosystem. As the adaptation becomes more pronounced, the new species or race radiates from its entrance into the new space or dies out if it cannot adapt and, most importantly, reproduce. The reduced genetic diversity, for example due to a bottleneck, will unavoidably increase inbreeding for the entire population. This may mean that a species may not be able to adapt to change in environmental conditions, each individual will have similar immune system as immune systems are genetically based. When a species becomes endangered, the population may fall below a minimum, whereby the forced interbreeding between the remaining animals will result in extinction. Natural breeding include inbreeding by necessity, and most animals only migrate when necessity arises. In many cases, the closest available mate is a mother, sister, grandmother, father, brother, or grandfather. In all cases, the environment presents stresses to remove from the population those individuals who cannot survive because of illness. In general, many mammal species, including humanity's closest primate relatives, avoid close inbreeding, possibly due to deleterious effects. Dear students, let's talk about the examples of genetic disorders related to the inbreeding. Although there are several examples of inbreeding populations of wild animals, the negative consequences of this inbreeding are poorly documented. In the South American sea lion, there was concern that recent population crashes would reduce genetic diversity. Historical analysis indicated that a population expansion from just two matrilineal lines was responsible for most of the individuals within the population. Even so, the diversity within the lines allowed great variation in the gene pool that may help to protect the South American sea lion from extinction. In lions, prides are often followed by related males in bachelor groups. When the dominant male is killed or driven off by one of these bachelors, a father may be replaced by his son. There is no mechanism for preventing inbreeding or to ensure outcrossing. In the prides, most lionesses are related to one another. If there is more than one dominant male, the group of alpha males are usually related. Two lions are then being line bred. Also, in some populations, such as the crater lions, it is known that a population bottleneck has occurred. In fact, predators are known for low genetic variance along with most of top portion of the trophic levels of an ecosystem. Additionally, the alpha males of two neighboring prides can be from the same litter. One brother may come to acquire leadership over another's pride and subsequently mate with his niece or cousins. However, killing another male's cubs upon the takeover allows the new selected gene complement of the incoming alpha male to prevail over the previous male. There are genetic assays being scheduled for lions to determine their genetic diversity. The preliminary studies show results inconsistent with the outcrossing paradigm based on individual environments of the studied groups. Cheetahs are another example of inbreeding. Thousands of years ago, the cheetah went through a population bottleneck that reduced its population dramatically, so the animals that are alive today are all related to one another. A consequence from inbreeding for this species has been high juvenile mortality, low fecundity, and poor breeding success. In a study on an island population of song sparrows, individuals that were inbred showed significantly lower survival rates than outbred individuals during a severe winter weather related population crash. These studies show that inbreeding, depression, and ecological factors have an influence on survival. Dear students, despite all its disadvantages, inbreeding can also have a variety of advantages, such as ensuring a child produced from the mating contains and will pass on a higher percentage of its mother or father's genetics, reducing the recombination load and allowing the expression of recessive advantageous phenotypes. Some species with a haplodiploid mating system depend on the ability to produce sons to mate with as a means of ensuring a mate can be found if no other male is available. It has been proposed that under circumstances when the advantages of inbreeding outweigh the disadvantages, preferential breeding within small groups could be promoted, potentially leading to speciation. Dear students, let's now summarize the lecture. Inbreeding is the production of offsprings from the mating or breeding of individuals or organisms that are closely related genetically. By analogy, the term is used in human reproduction, but more commonly refers to the genetic disorders and other consequences that may arise from expression of deleterious or recessive traits resulting from incestuous sexual relationships and consanguinity. The standard, that is mathematical measure for the level of inbreeding, is the inbreeding coefficient. It indicates the probability between 0% and 100% that genes at a randomly chosen location in the DNA are identical by descent. The technique assumes that there are two forms of a gene and that each form has an equal chance to be passed on to the next generation. One limitation on calculating inbreeding coefficients is the depth of pedigrees available. Animals with a shallow pedigree may have a low inbreeding coefficient simply because their related ancestors are not on the database. Therefore, inbreeding can arise in populations either as a result of various mechanisms that affect the mating system or from restrictions in actual or effective population size. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding inbreeding, inbreeding coefficient and its genetic consequences. Hope you have understood it well. See you next time with a new topic. Till then, take care and goodbye.